He commanded boardrooms and bent markets to his will, a titan of industry with a billion-dollar empire. But in the hushed elegance of a Michelin-starred restaurant with the city's elite as his audience, millionaire Sebastian Sterling chose to wage war on the one person who should have been his most cherished asset, his pregnant wife Amelia. The weapon: a simple strawberry dessert. The fallout: a public humiliation so brutal it would echo through the city's gilded halls. But what Sebastian didn't count on was that his most powerful investor, the architect of his dynasty, and the keeper of his secrets, was watching. And the next day, his own mother, Isabella Sterling, would deliver a verdict that would cost him more than just his inheritance. It would cost him everything. Amelia Sterling née Reed often felt like a ghost haunting the opulent corridors of her own life. The sprawling penthouse on Park Avenue with its panoramic views of Central Park was less a home and more a museum, each piece of furniture, each work of art curated not for comfort but for effect. It was a life purchased, not built, a stark contrast to the cozy, book-filled apartment she had left behind in Greenwich Village. She was 7 months pregnant, and the weight of the baby was a constant grounding presence in a life that otherwise felt unnervingly ethereal. She had met Sebastian Sterling a year and a half ago at a charity gala she was catering. He had been magnetic, a force of nature, in a bespoke Tom Ford suit, with a smile that could disarm armies, and a gaze that made her feel like the only woman in a room of 1,000. He wasn't just handsome. He was intoxicating, exuding a confidence that bordered on arrogance, but was at the time overwhelmingly attractive. Sebastian was the heir to the Sterling Croft empire, a global conglomerate with interests in real estate, technology, and finance. He was a man who had never been told no, a man who saw what he wanted and simply took it. That night he had wanted her. Their courtship had been a whirlwind, a blur of private jets to Paris for dinner, impromptu trips to the Amalfi Coast, and front-row seats at every major fashion week. He had showered her with gifts, a vintage Cartier watch, a closet filled with designer clothes she was too intimidated to wear, and finally a 10-carat diamond ring that felt heavier than its physical weight. He had swept her off her feet so thoroughly that she hadn't had a moment to catch her breath to truly consider the man behind the myth. Her friends had been cautiously optimistic, her parents, a retired history professor and a librarian from Connecticut, openly worried. "He's from a different world, Mia," her father had warned, his voice laced with concern. "Be careful you don't lose yourself in it." She had assured them she wouldn't, that Sebastian loved her for who she was, not for the woman he could mold her into. And in the beginning, it had felt true. He had listened enraptured to her stories about growing up in a small town, her dreams of opening her own bakery, her passion for classic literature. He had even, on a few rare occasions, traded his 5-star restaurants for a quiet night in allowing her to cook for him, praising her simple, heartfelt meals with a sincerity that had melted her heart. But after the wedding, after the ink had dried on the marriage certificate and she had officially become Mrs. Sebastian Sterling, a subtle shift had occurred. The listening became lecturing, the praise laced with critique. Her dream of a bakery was dismissed as a cute little hobby, her love of old books deemed unrefined. He began to curate her as he curated his art collection, suggesting no insisting on changes to her wardrobe, her hair, even the way she spoke. "You're a Sterling now, Amelia," he would say, his tone leaving no room for argument. "You need to look the part." And then there was his mother, Isabella Sterling. If Sebastian was a force of nature, Isabella was the tectonic plate shifting beneath it all. She was a woman carved from ice and steel, the true architect of the Sterling Croft empire. It had been her father's company, Croft Industries, that had merged with her husband's smaller real estate firm, and it was her shrewd business acumen that had transformed it into the global powerhouse it was today. Her husband Richard had been the face of the company, the charming diplomat, but Isabella had always been the one pulling the strings. After Richard's death 5 years ago, she had retreated from the day-to-day operations, installing Sebastian as CEO, but her influence remained absolute. She was the majority shareholder, the matriarch, the queen to whom even the king had to bow. Isabella's approval was the sun in Sebastian's universe, the one thing he craved and feared in equal measure. And from the moment Amelia had been introduced to her, she had felt the chill of a long, cold winter. Isabella had surveyed her with the critical eye of a jeweler inspecting a flawed diamond, her perfectly arched eyebrows conveying a disapproval that words never could. She was polite, of course, impeccably so. She never raised her voice, never uttered a single unkind word. But her compliments were backhanded, her smiles never reached her eyes, and her presence was a constant unspoken judgment. Amelia suspected that in Isabella's eyes she was a grave disappointment. She wasn't from old money, she hadn't attended an Ivy League school, and she had no powerful family connections to speak of. She was in the cutthroat world of the 1% a nobody, and a pregnant nobody at that, a fact that had seemed to solidify Isabella's disdain. When Sebastian had announced her pregnancy at a family dinner, Isabella had offered a cool, "Well, an heir is a necessity, I suppose," before changing the subject to a recent acquisition in the Asian market. Despite her coldness, or perhaps because of it, Sebastian was utterly devoted to his mother. He called her every morning, consulted her on every major business decision, and defended her every action. If Amelia ever dared to voice a complaint about Isabella's subtle slights, Sebastian would immediately shut her down. "You're being too sensitive, darling," he would say, a dismissive wave of his hand ending the conversation. "Mother is from a different generation. That's just how she is." The pregnancy had amplified Sebastian's controlling tendencies. He had hired a team of nutritionists, personal trainers, and doctors who reported directly to him. Her diet was monitored, her exercise regimen strictly enforced. He had even tried to dictate the name of their unborn son, insisting on Richard after his father, a name Amelia found stuffy and old-fashioned. When she had tentatively suggested James after her own beloved grandfather, Sebastian had laughed. "A butcher's name, Amelia. Don't be ridiculous. We're not naming the future of Sterling Croft James." The gilded cage was beginning to feel smaller, the air thinner. The loneliness was a palpable ache in her chest, a constant companion in the cavernous, silent apartment. She missed her old life, her independence, the simple, unexamined joy of being herself. She loved her baby, loved the feel of his tiny kicks against her ribs, but she was terrified of bringing him into this world of cold transactions and conditional love. She was trapped, and the only person who held the key was the man who had locked her in a man whose love was beginning to feel more like ownership. And as she prepared for another one of Sebastian's mandatory public appearances, a lavish dinner at the celebrated Manhattan restaurant Oriole, she had a premonition, a cold dread that washed over her that the bars of her cage were about to get a whole lot colder. She didn't know then that the evening wouldn't just be another exercise in public posturing. It would be the catalyst that would shatter her world, and in doing so, offer her the first terrifying glimpse of freedom. Oriole was a temple of modern American cuisine, a place where whispered power deals were brokered over plates of seared foie gras and glasses of vintage Bordeaux. The main dining room was a symphony of muted grays and shimmering gold, with a soaring glass wine tower as its centerpiece. It was a restaurant designed to impress, to intimidate, to remind its patrons of their own importance. It was, in short, Sebastian's favorite kind of place. They were seated at a prime table, a large circular booth that offered a panoramic view of the entire room. Sebastian was in his element, holding court, his voice a confident baritone that carried just enough to be heard by the neighboring tables. He was flanked by his inner circle, Marcus Thorne, his perpetually sycophantic COO, Chloe Vander Woodson, a skeletal socialite whose family owned half of the Upper East Side, and a visiting Japanese investor, Mr. Tanaka, whose favor Sebastian was trying to curry. Amelia sat beside him, a silent, smiling accessory in a lavender maternity gown that had been hand-picked by Sebastian's personal shopper. She felt like a doll on display, her growing belly the main attraction. She tried to engage in the conversation, to offer a comment on the art market or the latest political scandal. But Sebastian would invariably talk over her, or worse, answer for her, his hand possessively on her knee. "Amelia's not really interested in politics," he had said to Mr. Tanaka with a condescending chuckle. "She's more focused on..." Nesting. The meal was an interminable parade of courses, each one more elaborate and less appetizing than the last. Deconstructed salads, foams, and gels that tasted of nothing but pretension. Amelia, battling a wave of pregnancy-induced nausea, picked at her food, earning a sharp, disapproving glance from her husband. She longed for a simple bowl of pasta, for the comfort of her own kitchen, for a moment of peace, away from the suffocating scrutiny of this rarefied world. By the time the dessert menus arrived, a dull headache was throbbing at her temples. The waiter, a young man with kind eyes, recited the day's specials, a list of complex confections involving yuzu curd, matcha dust, and black sesame brittle. Amelia's stomach churned. All she wanted, with a sudden, desperate craving that only a pregnant woman can truly understand, was something simple, something sweet and familiar. "Could I just have a bowl of strawberries, please?" she asked the waiter, her voice barely a whisper. "Just plain strawberries with a little bit of sugar, if possible." The waiter smiled warmly. "Of course, madam. An excellent choice." He turned to leave, but Sebastian's voice, sharp as a whip, stopped him in his tracks. "Excuse me," he said, his smile gone, replaced by a tight, angry line. "I think you misheard my wife. She will have the Valrhona chocolate sphere with the salted caramel core." The table fell silent. Mr. Tanaka looked confused. Chloe smirked into her napkin, and Marcus's eyes darted nervously between Sebastian and Amelia. Amelia's face flushed with a mixture of embarrassment and defiance. "No, Sebastian," she said, her voice firmer than she intended. "I don't want the chocolate sphere. I want strawberries. The doctor said—" "The doctor—" Sebastian interrupted, his voice rising, drawing the attention of the nearby tables. "Are you going to let a quack with a medical degree dictate what you eat in a restaurant like this? You are a sterling. You will not embarrass me by ordering like a child." The humiliation was a physical blow, a hot, searing pain that spread from her chest to her fingertips. He was doing it again, belittling her, shaming her, treating her like an errant child in front of his friends and business associates. The room seemed to shrink, the curious stares of the other diners like daggers in her back. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She would not give him the satisfaction. She looked him straight in the eye, her chin held high. "I am not embarrassing you, Sebastian. I am pregnant, and I am listening to my body. I want strawberries." For a moment, a flicker of something unreadable crossed Sebastian's face. Surprise, respect. But it was gone as quickly as it came, replaced by a cold reptilian fury. He leaned in close, his voice a low, menacing hiss meant only for her. "You will eat what I tell you to eat. You will smile, and you will thank me for this exquisite meal. And when we get home, you and I will have a long talk about a wife's place. Do you understand me?" The threat hung in the air between them, thick and suffocating. The waiter stood frozen, a deer in the headlights, his tray held aloft like a shield. Mr. Tanaka was now studiously examining the wine list, while Chloe and Marcus were engaged in a sudden, animated conversation about the weather. Amelia felt a cold, terrifying clarity wash over her. This wasn't love. This wasn't even ownership. This was tyranny. Her father's words echoed in her mind. "Be careful you don't lose yourself." She had already lost so much, but in that moment she knew she could not lose this. She could not lose her right to her own body, her own choices, her own voice. Slowly, deliberately, she pushed her chair back from the table. The screech of the legs against the polished floor was a shriek in the suddenly silent room. She stood up, her hand resting protectively on her belly, her gaze never leaving Sebastian's stunned face. "No," she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "I don't understand." Without another word, she turned and walked away. She didn't run, she didn't storm out. She walked with a measured, dignified pace, her back straight, her head held high. She could feel the eyes of every person in the restaurant on her, but she didn't care. She walked past the wine tower, through the hushed bar, and out into the cool night air of Manhattan. The doorman, startled, rushed to hail her a cab. As she sank into the back seat, the tears she had held back finally came, hot and silent. They were not tears of sadness, but of a terrifying, exhilarating release. She didn't know where she was going, but for the first time in a very long time, she knew she was moving in the right direction. Back in the restaurant, Sebastian Sterling sat in stunned silence, the Valrhona chocolate sphere melting on his plate, his carefully constructed world beginning to crack at the seams. The taxi sped through the glittering canyons of Manhattan, but Amelia saw none of it. Her world had shrunk to the confines of the back seat, the rhythmic swish of the wipers, a metronome marking the end of one life and the terrifying, uncertain beginning of another. She didn't have her purse, her phone, or a single dollar to her name. Everything she owned, or rather everything Sebastian owned that she was permitted to use, was back at the penthouse she could no longer call home. Her first instinct was to go to her parents in Connecticut, but a deep, primal shame held her back. She wasn't ready to face their gentle "I told you so's," to see the pain in their eyes that would mirror her own. There was only one other place she could go, one person she could trust. "The West Village, please," she told the driver, giving him the address of her oldest friend Clara. Clara was a struggling artist who lived in a charming, chaotic walk-up apartment that smelled perpetually of turpentine and freshly brewed coffee. She had been Amelia's maid of honor, and her disapproval of Sebastian had been a quiet but constant hum in the background of their friendship. When Amelia arrived on her doorstep, tear-streaked and trembling, Clara didn't say a word. She simply opened her arms and held her friend, letting her sob until the storm had passed. Meanwhile, back at Oriole, chaos had erupted. Sebastian, after a moment of frozen disbelief, had thrown his napkin onto the table and stormed out after Amelia, leaving his guests in a state of awkward shock. Mr. Tanaka, a man for whom public decorum was paramount, made his excuses and left his interest in a partnership with the volatile Mr. Sterling significantly diminished. Chloe, ever the opportunist, immediately began texting a detailed, embellished account of the entire incident to her gossip columnist friend. The story of the millionaire who had publicly shamed his pregnant wife over a bowl of strawberries would be all over page 6 by morning. Sebastian, unable to find Amelia on the street, returned to the penthouse in a black rage. He hurled a Lalique crystal vase against the wall, the sound of it shattering echoing the state of his own composure. He tried calling her phone, but it went straight to voicemail. He paced the vast living room like a caged tiger, his fury mounting with every passing second. How dare she? How dare she defy him, humiliate him, make him look weak in front of his peers? His anger was a familiar beast, a roaring fire that had been stoked since childhood. He had always been taught that control was paramount, that emotion was a weakness to be suppressed, that the Sterling name was a shield and a weapon to be wielded with ruthless precision. Amelia, with her soft heart and her simple desires, had been a project for him, a beautiful, unpolished stone he could cut and shape into a jewel worthy of his name. Her defiance was not just an insult. It was a malfunction, a crack in the perfect facade he had so carefully constructed. He decided she was being hysterical, her pregnancy hormones making her irrational. She would come crawling back, of course. They always did. He would let her stew for a night, let her see how cold and unforgiving the world was without his protection, and then he would graciously allow her to apologize. But as the hours ticked by, and the apartment remained silent, a sliver of unease began to pierce through his anger. He called his head of security, a former Mossad agent named Avi, and ordered him to find Amelia. "Check her friends, her old apartment, her parents' place," he barked into the phone. "I want her found, now." While Sebastian was activating his private army, Amelia was curled up on Clara's lumpy sofa, wrapped in a faded quilt, sipping chamomile tea. For the first time, she told Clara everything. The constant criticism, the suffocating control, the casual cruelty disguised as love. Clara listened patiently, her expression hardening with each revelation. "I knew he was an ass, Mia," she said, her voice laced with fury. "But I didn't know he was a monster. You can't go back to him. You and the baby, you'll stay here as long as you need." The offer was a lifeline in a churning sea. For the first time in months, Amelia felt a glimmer of hope. She was safe. She was with someone who loved her unconditionally. But as she drifted into an exhausted sleep, she knew this was just the beginning of the battle. Sebastian would not let her go easily. He would use his money, his power, his influence to force her back into her cage. She had won a single skirmish, but the war for her freedom had yet to be fought. And she had no idea that her most powerful and most unlikely ally was about to enter the fray. The next morning, the Page 6 story broke, and the fallout was immediate and spectacular. The headline screamed, "Sterling's strawberry short-temper billionaire bullies pregnant wife in public." The article, quoting an unnamed source at a neighboring table, painted a vivid and damning portrait of Sebastian's behavior. The Sterling Croft stock took a small but noticeable dip in the pre-market trading. Sebastian's phone blew up with calls from his public relations team, his board members, and most ominously, his mother. Isabella Sterling was not a woman who read gossip columns. She considered them the literary equivalent of sewer water. But the story had been sent to her by no fewer than a dozen of her friends in the city's elite social circles, all feigning concern, all relishing the scandal. She read the article with a growing sense of cold dread. It wasn't the public nature of the fight that disturbed her, it was the content. The casual cruelty, the dismissive arrogance, the utter lack of respect for his pregnant wife. It was a pattern of behavior she knew all too well. It was the behavior of her late husband Richard, and it was a behavior she had sworn she would never tolerate in her son. She had spent years carefully crafting Sebastian's public image, sanding down his rough edges, teaching him to mask his father's volatile temper with a veneer of charm and sophistication. She had believed, or perhaps had forced herself to believe, that he was different, that he had her strength, not his father's weakness. The incident at Oriole proved her wrong. It was a public and undeniable confirmation of her deepest fear, that the monster she had married had been reborn in the son she adored. Her decision was swift and absolute. She did not call Sebastian. She did not text him. She summoned him. "My office. 1 hour," her message read. There was no salutation, no closing. It was not a request. It was a royal command. And as Sebastian read the text, a chill colder than any he had ever known snaked its way down his spine. He had faced down hostile takeovers, government regulators, and corporate spies. But nothing terrified him more than the prospect of his mother's wrath. The offices of the Sterling Croft empire occupied the top 10 floors of a sleek black skyscraper in Midtown, a monument to money and power. Isabella's personal office, however, was not on the penthouse level with Sebastian's. It was on the 50th floor, the same office she had occupied for 40 years. It was a room that eschewed modern minimalism for old-world gravitas. The walls were paneled in dark mahogany, lined with leather-bound books that were actually read, and dominated by a massive antique desk that had belonged to her father. The air was thick with the scent of old paper, lemon polish, and authority. When Sebastian arrived exactly 1 hour after being summoned, Isabella was not seated behind her desk. She was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, her back to him, looking out at the city that her family had helped to build. She was dressed in a charcoal gray Chanel suit, her silver hair styled in its customary immaculate chignon. She did not turn when he entered. "Mother," he began, his voice tight. "I can explain." "Can you?" she replied, her voice dangerously calm. She turned slowly, her blue eyes, usually so cool and calculating, now blazing with a cold fire he had not seen since he was a boy who had broken a priceless Ming vase. In her hand she held a tablet, the screen displaying the Page 6 article. "Can you explain this vulgarity, this public display of thuggery, or is it perhaps an accurate representation of the man I have raised?" Sebastian felt a flush of anger. It was a private matter blown out of proportion by gossip mongers. Amelia was being hysterical. Her hormones— "Do not," Isabella cut him off, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was more terrifying than any shout, "insult my intelligence by blaming this on a pregnant woman's hormones. I have read the article, Sebastian, and I have made some calls. I spoke to Caroline Vander Woodson, who heard it all from Chloe. I spoke to the manager of Oriole, a man my father put through college. I have the facts. And the facts are that you humiliated your wife, the mother of your unborn child, in the most public and brutish way imaginable." She walked towards him, her movements measured predatory. I have spent my entire life building this company, this legacy. I have protected it, nurtured it, and fought for it. I did not do so to have it all tarnished by the boorish behavior of a spoiled child who thinks his money gives him the right to be a tyrant. I am not a child. Sebastian shot back, his own temper flaring. I am the CEO of this company, and I will not be lectured about how I handle my wife. It was the wrong thing to say. Isabella stopped directly in front of him, her eyes locking onto his. Your wife, she said, her voice dripping with contempt. That girl, that sweet, kind girl whom you have systematically tried to break, is worth 10 of you. She has more character in her little finger than you have in your entire body. I was wrong about her, Sebastian. I thought she was weak. I see now that she is the strong one. She stood up to you. Something no one else in your pathetic, sycophantic little world has ever dared to do. She paused, letting the words hang in the air like poison. I saw your father in you last night, Sebastian. The same arrogance, the same cruelty, the same need to dominate and control everyone around him. I lived with that for 30 years. I will not stand by and watch another woman, another generation suffer the same fate. Sebastian was stunned into silence. His mother never spoke of his father, and certainly never in such terms. In his mind, Richard Sterling had been a god, a charismatic and powerful man to be emulated. To hear him described as a cruel bully by the one person whose opinion he valued above all others was disorienting, a blow to the very foundation of his identity. Your father, Isabella continued, her voice now filled with a weary sadness, was a brilliant man, but he was also a monster. He belittled me, he cheated on me, he hit me. I stayed for you. I stayed to protect you, to ensure that you would inherit this company, that you would have the power I never did. I thought I could teach you to be better than him. I see now that I have failed. Tears, hot and unfamiliar, welled in Sebastian's eyes. Mother, no. Yes, she said, her voice hardening again. And since I have failed to teach you, I will have to teach you another way. As of this moment, you are suspended as CEO of Sterling Croft, pending a full board review. I am exercising my right as majority shareholder to assume interim control. The words hit him like a physical blow. You can't do that. I can, she replied, her voice flat, absolute. And I have. But that is not all. Your credit cards have been canceled. Your access to the company's private jets and residences has been revoked. The security detail you sent to hunt down your wife has been recalled. They work for me now. And this, she gestured around the opulent office, is no longer your domain. She walked to her desk and picked up a single crisp envelope. This is a cashier's check for $1 million. It is the last cent you will ever receive from me or this family. Your trust fund, which I control, is hereby frozen. You are for the first time in your life on your own. She held out the envelope. Sebastian stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. $1 million. To most people it was a fortune. To him it was pocket change, a pittance, an insult. You are cutting me off, he whispered, the reality of the situation finally crashing down on him. I am setting you free, she corrected him. Free from the obligations of this family, this company, this legacy. You want to be a man, Sebastian? Then go and be one. Find a job. Pay your own rent. Make your own way in the world. And maybe, just maybe, you will learn something about humility, about respect, about what it truly means to be a man. She placed the envelope on the desk. My car is waiting. I am going to find Amelia. I am going to apologize to her on behalf of this family, and I am going to offer her my unconditional support whether she chooses to return to you or, as I suspect she will, to build a new life for herself and my grandchild. She walked to the door, pausing for a moment before she left. You have my number, she said without turning around. You can call me when you have become a person your son can be proud of. I hope for your sake that day comes. But I am not holding my breath. And with that, she was gone. Sebastian Sterling, the titan of industry. The king of Park Avenue stood alone in the center of the room, the silence deafening. He looked at the check on the desk, then at the city skyline beyond the window, a kingdom that was no longer his. He had had the world at his feet, and in a single brutish act of arrogance he had lost it all. The architect of his downfall was not a business rival or a market crash. It was a bowl of strawberries and the two women he had so grievously underestimated. The fall was as swift as it was brutal. News of Sebastian's suspension leaked by an anonymous source, Isabella's fiercely loyal and ruthlessly efficient communications director, hit the financial news wires like a lightning strike. The Sterling Croft stock, which had merely dipped after the Page 6 story, now plummeted. The narrative was no longer one of a marital spat. It was a crisis of leadership, a vote of no confidence from the very heart of the empire. Sebastian, dazed and disoriented, stumbled out of the Sterling Croft building into a world that no longer recognized his authority. His keycard for the executive garage was declined. The driver of his Maybach, a man who had ferried him around the city for a decade, averted his eyes and apologetically explained that his instructions were to wait for Mrs. Sterling Sr. Forced to take a yellow cab, Sebastian arrived at his penthouse to find the locks changed. A stoic security guard, one of Avi's men, handed him a single suitcase packed with a few suits, some casual wear, and his toiletries. Everything else, the art, the watches, the designer wardrobe, the very air of invincibility that had once permeated the space, was gone. He checked into a suite at the Carlyle, paying with the last of the cash in his wallet, the $1 million check from his mother feeling like a radioactive brick in his pocket. He was a refugee in his own city, an exile from his own life. His phone, once a constant stream of calls and messages from people who needed him, feared him, or wanted something from him, was now unnervingly silent. The sycophants, like Marcus Thorne, had vanished, their loyalty as shallow as their praise. The business associates were distant, their responses to his calls curt and noncommittal. He was no longer Sebastian Sterling, CEO. He was a liability, a pariah. His attempts to fight back were pathetic, desperate. He called his personal lawyer only to be informed that his retainer was paid by the Sterling Croft family office, and as he was no longer a part of that office, he would need to secure new counsel and provide a substantial upfront payment. He tried to rally support from the board members, men he had considered his allies, but they all echoed the same sentiment: their allegiance was to the company, and the company was Isabella. The unraveling was not just financial. It was psychological. For his entire life, Sebastian's identity had been inextricably linked to his name, his wealth, his power. Without them, he was nothing. He wandered the city like a ghost, unrecognized, unimportant. The deference he had always taken for granted was gone. Waiters were no longer obsequious doormen, no longer leapt to his service. He was just another face in the crowd, a man in a rumpled suit with fear in his eyes. Meanwhile, a very different story was unfolding in the West Village. Isabella, true to her word, had found Amelia at Clara's apartment. She had arrived not in her chauffeured Rolls-Royce, but in a discreet town car, and she had come alone. Clara, fiercely protective, had tried to block her at the door, but Amelia, seeing the look on her mother-in-law's face, had let her in. The two women, who had only ever interacted across the vast, icy expanse of a formal dining table, now sat opposite each other on Clara's mismatched chairs. And for the first time, Isabella looked at Amelia, not as an acquisition or a disappointment, but as a person. "I have come," Isabella began, her voice devoid of its usual frosty authority, "to offer you my most sincere and profound apology. For my son's behavior and for my own. I have been cold and judgmental and unfair to you from the very beginning. I saw you as a threat to my family's legacy when, in fact, you are the best thing that has ever happened to it." She told Amelia everything. About her own abusive marriage to Richard, a secret she had guarded for decades. About her fear of seeing the same monstrous traits in Sebastian. About her decision to cut him off to force him to confront the man he had become. Amelia listened in stunned silence, her perception of the formidable matriarch shifting with every word. She saw not a queen of ice, but a fellow survivor, a woman who had endured unimaginable pain and had found the strength to fight back. "I never knew," Amelia whispered. No one did, Isabella replied, a flicker of pain in her eyes. But I am telling you now because you have a right to know, and because I want you to know that you are not alone. Whatever you decide to do, wherever you decide to go, I will support you. The full resources of the Sterling family are at your disposal. Not Sebastian's resources, mine. In the days that followed, Isabella was as good as her word. She moved Amelia and Clara into a beautiful sun-drenched brownstone in Brooklyn Heights, a home filled with warmth and comfort, not cold prestige. She hired a new team of doctors, women who listened to Amelia and respected her choices. She set up a trust fund, not for Amelia but for her unborn child, ensuring his future would be secure independent of his father. But Isabella's greatest gift was not financial. It was the gift of empowerment. She began to mentor Amelia, teaching her about business finance and the inner workings of the Sterling Croft empire. She saw in Amelia a keen intelligence and a quiet strength that Sebastian had been too arrogant to notice. She started bringing her into meetings, introducing her to board members not as the estranged wife of the disgraced CEO, but as a valued consultant, a future leader. Amelia, for her part, blossomed. Freed from the shadow of Sebastian's control, she found her voice. Her dream of opening a bakery, once dismissed as a cute hobby, was now being discussed as a potential new venture for the company's lifestyle division. She had ideas, good ones, about sustainable sourcing, community engagement, and creating a brand with heart, a concept that was foreign to the old guard at Sterling Croft, but resonated deeply with a new generation of consumers. But as Amelia's star began to rise, a new and unexpected twist was about to emerge, a secret from Sebastian's past that even Isabella didn't know, a secret that would reframe everything and force a final dramatic confrontation. A private investigator hired by Isabella to do a deep dive into Sebastian's personal affairs, a due diligence measure before the official board vote on his termination, uncovered a series of regular high-value payments made from one of Sebastian's secret offshore accounts. The recipient was a woman named Dr. Evelyn Reed, a pediatric cardiologist based in Boston. The name Reed was a coincidence, but the connection was not. A little more digging revealed the shocking truth. Dr. Reed was the mother of a 7-year-old boy named Ethan, and on the boy's birth certificate, the father's name was listed as Sebastian Sterling. Sebastian had another child, a son he had kept hidden for 7 years. A son whose mother he had been paying to keep silent. The news was a bombshell, a betrayal that cut deeper than the public humiliation, deeper than the years of control and manipulation. For Isabella, it was the final, unforgivable sin. For Amelia, it was a revelation that changed the entire equation. She was not just fighting for her own freedom anymore. She was fighting for the future of 2 children, 2 brothers who deserved better than the father they had been given. The stage was set for a final reckoning, a confrontation that would not take place in a boardroom or a restaurant, but in the quiet, sterile environment of a lawyer's office, where the future of the Sterling dynasty would be decided once and for all. The meeting was set for a neutral location, the mahogany-paneled conference room of a top-tier family law firm in Manhattan. The air was thick with unspoken resentments and the heavy scent of expensive leather. On one side of the vast polished table sat Amelia, her posture erect, her expression calm and resolute. Beside her was Isabella, a silent, formidable presence, her face an unreadable mask of cold fury. On the other side sat Sebastian. He was a shadow of his former self. His bespoke suit was slightly rumpled, his face was pale and unshaven, and there were dark circles under his eyes. The cocksure arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow-eyed desperation. In the weeks since his exile, he had burned through a significant portion of his $1 million severance on lavish hotel suites and ill-advised attempts to maintain his old lifestyle. Reality was setting in cold and hard. He was no longer a king, he was a commoner, and he was terrified. He had come to the meeting expecting a negotiation, a chance to plead his case, to perhaps win back some semblance of his former life. He had prepared a speech, a carefully crafted apology filled with promises of change and therapy. He was ready to beg, to bargain, to grovel. He was not prepared for Dr. Evelyn Reed. She entered the room just as the lawyers were exchanging initial pleasantries. She was a tall, elegant woman with intelligent eyes and an air of quiet confidence. She was not a gold digger or a scorned lover. She was a respected physician, a woman of substance and integrity. She looked at Sebastian not with hatred, but with a kind of weary pity. Sebastian's face went white. "Evelyn," he stammered, "what are you doing here?" "Isabella and Amelia invited me." Evelyn said, her voice calm and even. She took a seat beside Isabella, forming a united front that left Sebastian utterly isolated. "We know, Sebastian," Isabella said, her voice like chipping ice. "We know about Ethan." The fight went out of him completely. He slumped in his chair, the carefully prepared speech dying on his lips. There was nothing left to say, no lie left to tell. The final, most damning secret of his life was out. The lawyers, sensing the shift, took over. What followed was not a negotiation but a dictation of terms. Amelia was filing for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences. She was not asking for alimony. She was not asking for a single cent of the sterling fortune for herself. The Brooklyn brownstone had been purchased for her outright by Isabella. The bakery, to be named The Humble Crumb, was being funded as a subsidiary of Sterling Croft, with Amelia as its CEO and majority owner. The custody of their unborn son, to be named James, was to be hers and hers alone. Sebastian would have no parental rights. His name would not be on the birth certificate. He would be allowed supervised visitation at Amelia's discretion only if he completed a year of intensive anger management and narcissistic personality disorder therapy, with progress reports submitted by his doctors. And then came the matter of Ethan. Evelyn spoke, her voice filled not with anger, but with a fierce protective love for her son. She explained that she had never wanted Sebastian's money. She had accepted it only because he had threatened to use his power to fight for custody, to drag her and her son through a vicious court battle she could not afford. "All I ever wanted," she said, looking directly at Sebastian, "was for you to be a father to him, to know him, to love him. But you were only ever interested in silencing him." The new terms drawn up by Isabella's lawyers were ironclad. Sebastian was to legally acknowledge Ethan as his son. A multi-million-dollar trust identical to the one set up for James would be established for Ethan, managed not by Sebastian, but by Evelyn and a financial advisor appointed by Isabella. Sebastian's visitation with Ethan would be subject to the same therapeutic requirements as his visitation with James. Sebastian sat speechless as his life was dismantled piece by piece. He looked from Amelia's calm, determined face to Evelyn's dignified strength, to his mother's unforgiving glare. He saw no hatred, no desire for revenge. He saw only a cold, hard justice, a final closing of accounts. He had built his life on a foundation of power and control, and these three women, the three women he had wronged the most, had systematically taken it all away, using not brute force but intelligence, unity, and a quiet, unshakable resolve. He had one card left to play, one last desperate gambit. He looked at his mother. "If I agree to all of this," he said, his voice cracking, "will you let me come back? Back to the company, back to the family?" Isabella looked at him for a long, silent moment. "The company," she said finally, "is in better hands now. Amelia has brought a new perspective, a new energy. The board has officially terminated your contract and has appointed me as permanent CEO. Amelia will have a seat on the board after the baby is born." She paused. "As for the family, family is not a birthright, Sebastian. It is something you earn. It is built on love and trust and respect. You have broken that trust. You have desecrated that love. You have shown no respect. You are my son, and a part of me will always love you. But I do not respect the man you have become. So no, you cannot come back. Not now. Maybe not ever." It was the final blow. The last glimmer of hope was extinguished. Sebastian, utterly defeated, picked up the pen and signed the papers. He signed away his wife, his children, his company, his fortune. He signed away his entire life. He walked out of the conference room a free man, but he had never been more imprisoned. He was trapped in the lonely, desolate prison of his own making. One year later, the Humble Crumb was the most popular bakery in Brooklyn. Its warm, inviting atmosphere and delicious, unpretentious pastries were a testament to Amelia's vision. She was a natural CEO, leading with kindness and empathy, and her employees were fiercely loyal. She was a wonderful mother to baby James, a happy, thriving child who was showered with love not just from his mother but from his grandmother Isabella, his aunt Clara, and his new extended family Evelyn, and his older brother Ethan. Isabella, with Amelia by her side, had transformed Sterling Croft. They had divested from morally ambiguous industries and invested heavily in sustainable technologies and socially responsible ventures. The company was more profitable than ever, but it was also a company with a soul. Isabella had found not just a new purpose, but a daughter she had never had, and a joy she had thought long lost. Evelyn and Amelia had become close friends, united by their shared experience and their love for their sons. Ethan, a bright and sensitive boy, was slowly getting to know his little brother, forming a bond that would, they hoped, overcome the sins of their father. And Sebastian. He had disappeared from the headlines, from the society pages, from the world he had once ruled. Some said he was living in a modest apartment in Queens, working a mid-level finance job. Others whispered he had been seen attending therapy sessions. He had made a few tentative, supervised visits to see his son's awkward, stilted affairs, where he seemed more like a stranger than a father. Whether he would ever truly change, whether he would ever earn his way back into their lives, remained to be seen. But the world no longer revolved around him. His story was no longer the main event. It was a cautionary tale, a footnote in the much larger, much more interesting story of the three women who had taken his power, reclaimed their own, and built a new and better world from the ashes of the one he had tried to burn down. They had faced the fire, and they had emerged not unscathed, but stronger, wiser, and finally gloriously free. So what do you think? Was this a story of justice, or a story of revenge? Sebastian Sterling lost his empire, his family, and his fortune, all because he couldn't see the value in the people right in front of him. He thought his power made him invincible, but in the end, it was the quiet strength of his wife, the fierce love of a mother he didn't know, and the cold resolve of the woman who gave him everything that brought his world crashing down. It's a powerful reminder that true wealth isn't measured in dollars, but in love, respect, and dignity. The clinking of champagne glasses usually marks a celebration, but at the Sterling family's annual foundation dinner, it became the sound of a life shattering. In front of New York's high society billionaire patriarch, a man who seemingly had it all raised his glass. But the woman he toasted wasn't his wife of 25 years, the mother of his children, who had built his empire alongside him. It was a woman half her age, a stranger to them all. What followed was not just a scandal, but a war. A war for a name, a fortune, and a family. And by the next day, the battle lines would be drawn in the most shocking way imaginable. The grand ballroom of the Pierre Hotel was a symphony of hushed murmurs, and the gentle clinking of silverware against fine china. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small carriage, dripped light onto the assembled guests, a veritable who's who of New York's philanthropic and financial elite. At the center of it all, at the head of the most prominent table, sat the Sterling family. They were the sun around which this glittering solar system of wealth and influence revolved. At the head of the table, radiating an aura of untouchable power, was Richard Sterling. At 55, he was a man carved from granite and ambition, with a mane of silver-streaked dark hair and eyes the color of a stormy sea. He was a self-made titan of industry, a man who had clawed his way from the grimy streets of Hell's Kitchen to the pinnacle of Manhattan's real estate world. His company Sterling Holdings owned a significant portion of the city's skyline, and his name was synonymous with audacious deals and ruthless success. He was a king in his kingdom, and tonight was his coronation. The annual Sterling Foundation Gala was the jewel in his philanthropic crown, a night where he gave back a fraction of his immense fortune with the kind of ostentatious generosity that only the truly wealthy can afford. Beside him, a study in quiet elegance and strained composure, was his wife, Catherine Sterling. At 50, she was still a breathtaking woman with classic patrician features, hair the color of spun gold, and eyes a startling shade of sapphire. She was born into old money, a scion of the prestigious Davenport family, and she had brought to their marriage a pedigree and a social grace that Richard, for all his billions, could never have acquired on his own. She was the perfect corporate wife. The silent partner who had smoothed his rough edges, hosted his endless dinners, and raised their 2 children while he conquered the world. She wore a deep emerald gown that shimmered under the chandeliers, a cascade of diamonds at her throat that had been a 25th anniversary gift from Richard. A gift she was beginning to realize that felt more like a severance package with each passing day. The chasm that had opened between them over the past few years was a silent gaping wound, a truth they both acknowledged but never dared to speak aloud. Across from them sat their children, the products of this gilded cage. 24-year-old Liam was the heir apparent, a younger, softer version of his father. He had Richard's ambition but lacked his killer instinct, a fact that was a constant source of friction between them. Liam, ever the dutiful son, had joined Sterling Holdings after graduating from Wharton, but he felt more like a highly paid subordinate than a future leader. He was handsome, charming, and desperate for his father's approval, a commodity that Richard dispensed with miserly reluctance. Next to Liam was his younger sister, 21-year-old Chloe. She was the family's resident firebrand, a passionate and idealistic art history major at Columbia, who viewed her father's world with a mixture of disdain and reluctant dependence. Chloe had her mother's beauty, but her father's defiant spirit, a combination that made her both captivating and perpetually at odds with her family's expectations. She loved her father, but she loathed what he represented, the cold, calculating world of money and power that she saw as a corrupting force. The dinner had been a carefully orchestrated performance, a series of speeches praising Richard's Midas touch and his supposed magnanimity. Catherine had played her part flawlessly, smiling, nodding, and exuding an air of serene pride as she listened to the endless litany of her husband's accomplishments. But beneath the surface, a cold dread was coiling in her stomach. She had seen the subtle shifts in Richard's behavior over the past year, the late nights he claimed were business meetings, the secretive phone calls he took in his study, the apathetic distance that had replaced the warmth in his eyes. She had suspected, of course. A woman always knows. But she had clung to a desperate hope that she was wrong, that the foundation they had built together was strong enough to withstand the tremors of his midlife crisis. The main course had been cleared, and the waiters were now moving with silent efficiency, refilling champagne glasses for the final toast of the evening. This was Richard's moment, the culmination of the night's adulation. He was expected to deliver a heartfelt speech thanking his supporters, his colleagues, and, of course, his loving family. He was expected to play the part of the benevolent patriarch, the man who had everything and was grateful for it. Richard rose from his chair, a glass of Dom Perignon in his hand. A hush fell over the ballroom as all eyes turned to him. He basked in the attention, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. He looked every inch the conquering hero, the master of the universe. He began his speech with the usual platitudes, his voice a deep, confident baritone that resonated with power. He thanked the board of the foundation, the generous donors, the tireless staff. He spoke of his vision for the future, of the legacy he intended to build. Catherine watched him, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She had heard this speech 100 times before in 100 different ballrooms. It was a well-rehearsed script designed to charm and impress. But tonight something was different. There was a reckless, almost cruel glint in his eyes that she had never seen before. A sense of impending doom washed over her so strong that she had to grip the edge of the table to steady herself. Liam and Chloe were also watching their father, their expressions a mixture of pride and apprehension. They too sensed that something was amiss. The air was thick with unspoken tension. A fragile silence stretched taut over the glittering room. Richard paused, taking a slow sip of his champagne. He let the silence hang in the air for a dramatic beat, his eyes sweeping across the sea of expectant faces. And then he did the unthinkable. His gaze shifted, moving past Catherine, past his children, to a table in the corner of the room. It was a table of lower-level executives from Sterling Holdings, the kind of people who were usually seated in the back, far from the center of power. But tonight one of them was about to be thrust into the spotlight. "But there is one more person I need to thank," Richard said, his voice dropping to a more intimate, almost caressing tone. "A person who has brought a new light into my life, a new passion, a new inspiration." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Catherine's blood ran cold. She followed his gaze, her eyes landing on a young woman seated at the corner table. The woman was beautiful in a way that was both obvious and slightly vulgar. She had long, raven-black hair, a voluptuous figure poured into a tight scarlet dress, and a look of triumphant arrogance on her face. Catherine had never seen her before, but she knew with a certainty that was as sharp and painful as a shard of glass in her heart who this woman was. This was her replacement. "To Ella," Richard declared, raising his glass high, "for showing me what it truly means to be alive." The name hung in the air, a poisoned dart that found its mark in the heart of the Sterling family. Ella. It was a name that would be seared into their memories forever. The silence that followed was deafening. It was a silence filled with shock, with outrage, with 1,000 unspoken questions. The guests stared, mouths agape, their eyes darting from Richard to Catherine to the scarlet woman who was now preening under the spotlight. The carefully constructed facade of the Sterling family had been shattered, and the raw, ugly truth was now laid bare for all to see. For Catherine, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The chandeliers above her blurred into a smear of light. The faces around her became distorted masks of pity and morbid curiosity. The air was thick and heavy, and she felt as if she were drowning. She looked at Richard, at the man she had loved, the man she had built a life with, and saw a stranger. His face was flushed with a mixture of arrogance and defiance, his eyes shining with a feverish light. He was not just acknowledging his affair, he was celebrating it, flaunting it in the most public and humiliating way possible. Liam was the first to react. He shot to his feet, his face pale with fury. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and disbelief. He looked from his father to the woman in red, a look of pure loathing on his face. Chloe was frozen in her chair, her eyes wide with horror. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she looked at her mother, her expression a silent plea for this nightmare to end. But Richard was unfazed. He simply smiled, a cold, dismissive smile that did not reach his eyes. "Sit down, Liam," he said, his voice dangerously calm. "This doesn't concern you." "Doesn't concern me?" Liam's voice rose, attracting the attention of the surrounding tables. "You're humiliating my mother in front of the entire city, and it doesn't concern me." The scarlet woman Ella seemed to revel in the drama. She stood up, a smug smile playing on her lips, and raised her own glass in a mock toast to Catherine. It was a calculated act of cruelty, a declaration of victory. That was the final straw for Catherine. The numbness that had enveloped her began to recede, replaced by a white-hot fury. She rose from her chair with a grace and dignity that belied the turmoil raging within her. She did not look at Richard. She did not look at Ella. She looked at her children, her eyes filled with a strength and resolve that they had never seen before. Without a word, she turned and walked away from the table. She moved with a regal composure, her head held high, her back straight. The emerald gown shimmered around her like a suit of armor. She did not run. She did not cry. She simply walked with a purpose and a finality that was more powerful than any shouted words or shed tears. The entire ballroom watched her go, a silent collective witness to the public execution of a marriage. The murmurs started, then a rising tide of whispers and speculation. The Sterling Foundation Gala would be remembered not for its philanthropy, but for the scandal that had erupted at its heart. As Catherine walked through the grand lobby of the Pierre, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The life she had known for 25 years was over. The man she had loved was gone, replaced by a cruel and reckless stranger. The future she had envisioned was a barren wasteland. She stepped out into the cool night air, the sounds of the city a jarring contrast to the suffocating silence of the ballroom. A lone tear finally escaped, tracing a cold path down her cheek. It was a tear not of sadness, but of rage. Richard had declared war, and Catherine Sterling, the quiet, elegant wife, was about to become a warrior. The battle for the Sterling name, for her children, for her very identity, had just begun. The limousine ride back to the Sterling's palatial Fifth Avenue penthouse was a study in suffocating silence. The air, usually filled with the comfortable chatter of a family returning from a successful event, was now thick with a toxic mixture of shock, anger, and a grief so profound it felt like a physical weight. Catherine sat ramrod straight, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the blur of city lights outside the tinted windows. She was a statue carved from ice, her face a mask of impenetrable composure. The single tear she had shed outside the hotel was the only outward sign of the tempest raging within her. Liam sat opposite her, his jaw clenched so tightly that a muscle throbbed in his cheek. He kept clenching and unclenching his fists, his knuckles white. He was a coiled spring of impotent fury, his eyes darting between his mother's stoic profile and the empty seat beside her, the seat where his father should have been. Richard, in a final act of brazen disrespect, had left the gala with Ella, their laughter echoing in the marble lobby as they disappeared into a waiting sports car, leaving his family to navigate the fallout of his public betrayal. Chloe was curled into the corner of the limousine, her small frame racked with silent sobs. She had her face buried in her hands, her shoulders shaking. The sound of her weeping was a heartbreaking counterpoint to the tense silence, a raw, unfiltered expression of the pain they were all feeling. She was the family's emotional barometer, and right now she was indicating a storm of epic proportions. The doorman at their building, a man who had greeted them with a deferential smile for over a decade, averted his eyes as they stepped out of the car. The news, it seemed, had already traveled faster than the speed of light in the hyper-connected world of Manhattan's elite. The scandal was already a raging wildfire, and they were at the epicenter of the inferno. The penthouse, which had always been a symbol of their success and a sanctuary from the outside world, now felt like a gilded cage, its opulent furnishings and priceless art mocking them with their cold, indifferent beauty. The silence that had filled the car followed them into the apartment, amplifying the cavernous space and making it feel even more empty and desolate. Catherine walked directly to the bar, her movements precise and deliberate. She poured herself a generous measure of brandy, her hand steady. She took a long, slow sip, the fiery liquid a welcome burn in her throat. She needed its warmth to combat the icy chill that had settled deep in her bones. Liam finally broke the silence, his voice a raw, ragged whisper. "I can't believe him. I can't believe he would do that. To you. To us." Chloe lifted her head, her face streaked with tears, her eyes red and swollen. "How could he? Mom! In front of everyone! Who is that woman?" Catherine turned to face her children, her expression softening for the first time that night. She saw their pain, their confusion, their shattered illusions, and a fierce protective love surged through her. They were the only thing that mattered now. "Her name apparently is Ella," she said, her voice devoid of emotion. "And as for who she is, she's a mistake. A very public, very expensive mistake that your father has just made." She took another sip of her brandy, her mind already working, calculating, planning. The shock was beginning to wear off, replaced by a cold, clear-eyed resolve. She had been a CEO's wife for 25 years. She knew how to strategize. She knew how to fight. "What are we going to do?" Liam asked, looking to his mother for guidance, his anger giving way to a sense of helplessness. He was used to his father being in control, making the decisions. Now that foundation had been ripped out from under him. "First," Catherine said, her voice firm, "we are going to stick together. Your father has made his choice. He has chosen to align himself with that woman. He has drawn a line in the sand. Now we must draw our own." She walked over to the large picture window that overlooked Central Park, the city lights a glittering tapestry below. She had stood at this window countless times, looking out at the empire she had helped Richard build. Now she was looking at a battlefield. "He thinks he's won," she said, her voice a low, dangerous murmur. "He thinks he can just discard me, discard us without any consequences. He has underestimated me. He has underestimated his own children." She turned back to them, her sapphire eyes burning with a newfound fire. "This is not just about a marriage anymore. This is about our family. It's about our name. It's about everything we've built. And I will not let him destroy it." The next morning, the city awoke to the Sterling scandal splashed across the front page of every tabloid and news site. "Sterling's Scarlet Night," screamed the headline of the New York Post, accompanied by a grainy photo of Richard and Ella leaving the gala, his arm wrapped possessively around her waist. The article was a salacious mix of facts and speculation detailing Richard's public toast, Catherine's dignified exit, and Ella's mysterious identity. She was painted as a young, ambitious marketing executive from Sterling Holdings, a vixen who had sunk her claws into the billionaire tycoon. The phones at the penthouse began to ring incessantly, a cacophony of calls from concerned friends, gossiping acquaintances, and reporters hungry for a quote. Catherine instructed the housekeeper to unplug them. She needed to think, to plan, to prepare for the war that was coming. She called a meeting with her personal lawyer, a shrewd and formidable woman named Jessica Davenport, who also happened to be her cousin. Jessica arrived within the hour, her face a mask of grim determination. She was a bulldog in a Chanel suit, and she was fiercely loyal to Catherine. They sat in the formal living room, the scene of so many happy family gatherings now transformed into a war room. Catherine, with a clarity that surprised even herself, laid out the events of the previous night, her voice calm and measured. She did not cry. She did not rage. She presented the facts with the detached precision of a surgeon. Jessica listened intently, her pen flying across her legal pad. When Catherine had finished, she looked up, her expression a mixture of sympathy and steely resolve. "He's a fool, Catherine. A monumental, arrogant fool, but he's a dangerous fool. We need to move quickly and decisively." "I want a divorce," Catherine said, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "But I want more than that. I helped him build that company. My family's money was the seed that started it all. My social connections opened doors for him that would have otherwise been bolted shut. I am not just his wife. I am his partner. And I will not be discarded like a piece of outdated furniture." Jessica nodded, a predatory gleam in her eyes. "Under New York law, marital assets are subject to equitable distribution. And we will argue that your contributions to the marriage and to the business were significant. We will go after half of everything, Catherine. The company, the properties, the art collection, everything." "Good," Catherine said. "But there's more. I want to protect the children. Liam's position at the company, Chloe's trust fund. He will try to use them as leverage against me. I know he will. We'll file for an immediate injunction to freeze all marital assets," Jessica said. "That will prevent him from moving money around or making any major financial decisions without court approval. We'll also petition for temporary spousal and child support. We'll hit him hard and fast before he has time to fully comprehend what's happening." While Catherine was plotting her legal strategy, Liam was facing his own battle. He had gone to the office against his mother's advice, determined to confront his father. He found Richard in his corner office, a vast expanse of glass and steel with a panoramic view of the city. He was on the phone, laughing, a sound that made Liam's blood boil. Ella was perched on the edge of his desk, looking as if she owned the place. She was wearing a dress that was even more revealing than the one from the night before, and she was sipping a latte from a Sterling Holdings mug. When Richard saw Liam, his expression hardened. He ended the call and stood up, squaring his shoulders as if preparing for a fight. "What do you want, Liam?" he asked, his voice cold and dismissive. "I want to know what you were thinking," Liam said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "I want to know how you could do that to Mom." Richard scoffed, a look of pure arrogance on his face. "Your mother and I have been unhappy for years. It was a charade, a business arrangement. It's time for me to be happy. Ella makes me happy." Ella smiled, a smug, triumphant smile. "Your father is a passionate man, Liam. He needs a woman who can keep up with him." The condescending tone, the casual disrespect, it was too much for Liam to bear. "You have no idea what you've done," he said, his voice dangerously low. "You've just destroyed this family." "Don't be so dramatic," Richard said, waving a dismissive hand. "It's a divorce. It happens every day. Your mother will be well taken care of. You and Chloe will be fine. Nothing has to change." "Nothing has to change." Liam's voice rose to a shout. "You just publicly humiliated the woman who has stood by you for 25 years, and you think nothing has to change. You've lost your mind." "Watch your tone, Liam," Richard warned, his eyes narrowing. "You're an employee of this company, and I am still your father." "No," Liam said, a sudden chilling clarity descending upon him. "You're not. Not anymore. The man I called my father wouldn't have done this. He wouldn't have been so cruel, so selfish." He took a step back, his decision made in that moment of painful disillusionment. "I quit," he said, the words feeling both terrifying and liberating. "I will not work for you. I will not be a part of this circus." He turned and walked out of the office, ignoring Richard's bellow of his name. He walked past the curious stares of the other employees, past the whispers and the pitying looks. He walked out of Sterling Holdings, the company he had once believed was his birthright, and he did not look back. Meanwhile, Chloe was waging her own more subtle war. She had spent the morning on the phone, not with friends, but with the trustees of the Davenport Family Foundation, the charitable organization established by her maternal grandparents. She was a junior board member, a position she had always taken seriously. She knew the inner workings of the foundation, and she knew where the pressure points were. She spoke with her great-aunt, the formidable matriarch of the Davenport clan, a woman who had never fully approved of Richard Sterling. Chloe, with a passion and eloquence that belied her years, painted a vivid picture of Richard's public betrayal, of his cruelty, of his disrespect for the family name. She spoke not just as a grieving daughter, but as a Davenport defending the honor of their lineage. By the time she hung up the phone, the wheels were in motion. The Davenport family, a powerful and influential force in their own right, was mobilizing. They were cutting ties with Richard, both personal and professional. They were withdrawing their support from his ventures, closing doors that had once been held wide open. They were, in their own quiet, devastating way, declaring war on Richard Sterling. When Liam arrived back at the penthouse, his face pale but resolute, he found his mother and sister in the living room. He told them what he had done, that he had quit his job, that he had walked away from his father. Catherine looked at him, a fierce pride in her eyes. "You did the right thing, Liam," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "You chose your family. You chose your integrity." Chloe then told them about her own conversations, about the Davenport family's response. A small, grim smile touched Catherine's lips. The battle lines were being drawn, and she was not fighting alone. The next day, the family gathered in the living room, a united front against the storm that was about to break. Jessica arrived with a mountain of paperwork, the first salvos in their legal war. The divorce petition, the injunction to freeze assets, the request for spousal support. It was all there, ready to be filed. As they were reviewing the documents, the doorman buzzed up. "Mr. Sterling is on his way up," he announced, his voice strained. A cold silence fell over the room. Catherine looked at her children, her expression unreadable. "Let him come," she said, her voice calm. "It's time we had a family meeting." Richard strode into the apartment a few minutes later, his face a thunderous mask of rage. He was not used to being defied. He was not used to his authority being questioned. He was a king who had just discovered that his kingdom was in revolt. He glared at Jessica, at the pile of legal documents on the coffee table. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. "It's a divorce petition, Richard," Catherine said, her voice as cold and clear as ice. "And an injunction to freeze all our assets. You will not be spending another dime of our money on that woman." Richard's face contorted with fury. He turned to Liam. "And you pathetic, ungrateful whelp, you walk out on my company, on your future." "I walked out on you," Liam corrected, his voice steady. "I chose my mother. I chose my family." Richard then turned his wrath on Chloe. "And you went crying to your ancient relatives, turning them against me." "I told them the truth," Chloe said, her voice unwavering. "You're the one who brought this on yourself." Richard looked from one defiant face to another, a dawning realization in his eyes. He had expected them to crumble. He had expected them to be weak, to be dependent on him. He had never imagined that they would stand together, that they would fight back. He let out a harsh, humorless laugh. "You think you can win this? You think you can take me on? I built this empire. I am Richard Sterling." "And I am Catherine Sterling," she said, her voice quiet but filled with an unshakable strength. "And these are our children. You made a choice, Richard. You chose her." She gestured vaguely in the direction of the city, a dismissive wave of her hand. "And now we have made our choice. We choose each other. We choose this family." The battle had been joined. The lines had been drawn. And in the opulent penthouse overlooking Central Park, the Sterling family minus its patriarch stood united, ready to face the storm. The next day had come, and the family had chosen. They had chosen her. They had chosen Catherine. They had chosen themselves. And Richard Sterling, the king who had so carelessly discarded his queen, was about to discover that he was no longer ruling a kingdom, but a wasteland of his own making. The war had just begun, and the casualties were yet to be counted. The weeks that followed the fateful dinner were a blur of legal maneuvering, public scrutiny, and a profound seismic shift in the Sterling family's universe. The battle that Richard had so arrogantly ignited was now a full-blown war fought not on a battlefield of mud and steel, but in the sterile conference rooms of law firms, the gossip columns of the city's tabloids, and the hushed, judgmental circles of New York's elite. Richard, accustomed to a world that bent to his will, was stunned by the ferocity and unity of the opposition. He had expected Catherine to be a weeping, broken woman, begging for a reconciliation or a quiet, generous settlement. He had expected his children to be petulant, but ultimately compliant, their dependence on his wealth a leash he could easily tug. He had fundamentally misjudged them, and that miscalculation was proving to be a costly one. The injunction freezing their assets was the first major blow. It was a strategic masterstroke by Jessica Davenport, a legal chokehold that brought Richard's freewheeling financial life to a screeching halt. Suddenly, every major transaction, every transfer of funds required court approval. His plan to set Ella up in a lavish multi-million-dollar condo to shower her with the kind of extravagant gifts that would solidify her position as the new woman in his life was abruptly thwarted. He was a king with a temporarily locked treasury, and the humiliation was exquisite. He retaliated, as was his nature, with brute force. He assembled a legal team of the most ruthless, high-priced sharks in the city, lawyers known for their scorched earth tactics. They filed a counter-petition accusing Catherine of being a gold digger, a woman who had lived a life of luxury on his dime and was now trying to bleed him dry. They painted her as a cold, calculating woman who had been emotionally distant for years, a wife in name only. It was a smear campaign designed to wound and intimidate. But Catherine, buoyed by the unwavering support of her children, and the formidable Jessica, refused to be cowed. She had spent 25 years in Richard's shadow, her own intelligence and strength sublimated to his ego. Now that shadow was gone, and she was stepping into the light, discovering a resilience she never knew she possessed. The public narrative which Richard had assumed he could control was also turning against him. His brazen toast to his mistress had been a public relations disaster, a display of such breathtaking arrogance that it had alienated even his most ardent supporters. The story of Catherine's dignified exit of her children's loyalty had captured the city's imagination. She was cast as the wronged woman, the graceful matriarch defending her family's honor. He was the villain, the callous billionaire who had traded his loyal wife for a younger, flashier model. The other woman, Ella, was also finding that her victory was not as sweet as she had imagined. She had craved the spotlight, the legitimacy that came with being on the arm of a man like Richard Sterling. But the spotlight was now a harsh, unforgiving glare. She was vilified in the press, branded a homewrecker and a social climber. The wives of Richard's friends and business associates, women who had once been her colleagues or superiors, now looked at her with undisguised contempt. She was a pariah, a scarlet woman in a city that prized loyalty and discretion above all else. The war for the Sterling Empire was also being fought on a more personal and perhaps more painful front. Richard, enraged by his children's defiance, began to turn the screws. He cut off their credit cards, a petty act of retaliation that was more symbolic than financially devastating. He sent a curt formal letter to Chloe informing her that he would no longer be contributing to her tuition at Columbia. He tried to bar Liam from the family's country home in the Hamptons, a place filled with a lifetime of memories. But for every move he made, Catherine had a countermove. She used her own personal funds, a substantial inheritance from her parents that Richard had never been able to touch, to cover Chloe's tuition and ensure that her children's lives were not disrupted. She reminded Richard through Jessica that the Hamptons house was a marital asset and he had no legal right to bar his own son from the property. The children, for their part, were discovering their own strengths in the crucible of this family crisis. Liam, freed from the suffocating pressure of his father's expectations, began to explore his own interests. He had always had a passion for sustainable architecture, an idea that Richard had dismissed as tree-hugging nonsense. Now he started taking online courses, networking with people in the field, and even sketching out plans for his own small, eco-friendly development company. He was finding a purpose that was entirely his own, a sense of self-worth that was not tied to the Sterling name or his father's approval. Chloe, always the family's conscience, channeled her anger and hurt into her activism. She became even more involved in her art history studies, focusing on the role of female artists who had been overlooked or marginalized by their male counterparts. She saw a parallel in her mother's story, and it fueled her passion. She organized a student art exhibition on campus, showcasing the work of up-and-coming female artists, and dedicated it to her mother. It was a small act of defiance, but it was a powerful statement of her loyalty and her values. The standoff continued for months, a tense and bitter war of attrition. The legal bills mounted, the emotional toll grew, and the chasm within the family deepened into an unbridgeable canyon. Richard, isolated and increasingly paranoid, became more and more dependent on Ella. But the foundations of their relationship, built on a reckless impulse and a shared desire for a certain kind of lifestyle, were beginning to show cracks. Ella was growing impatient. The life of a pampered billionaire's mistress was not materializing as she had envisioned. The frozen assets meant that the shopping sprees, the lavish trips, the jewelry were all on hold. She was living in a luxury hotel, a gilded cage, but she was not the mistress of a Fifth Avenue penthouse. She was a woman in limbo, and the constant public scrutiny was beginning to wear on her. She had wanted to be a queen, but she was beginning to feel more like a pawn in a game she didn't fully understand. The turning point came during a deposition for the divorce case. It was the first time that Catherine and Richard had been in the same room since that fateful night at the penthouse. The air in the conference room was thick with animosity, a palpable living thing. Richard's lawyers, true to their reputation, came out swinging. They questioned Catherine about her spending habits, her social life, her role as a mother. They tried to paint her as a frivolous, detached woman who had contributed nothing to the marriage but her pedigree. Catherine, cool and composed, answered their questions with a quiet dignity that infuriated them. She had her own secret weapon, a collection of meticulously kept diaries that she had maintained for 25 years. They were a detailed record of her life with Richard. A chronicle of the dinner parties she had hosted, the business trips she had organized, the clients she had wooed, the personal sacrifices she had made. When it was Jessica's turn to question Richard, she was relentless. She presented him with evidence of his lavish spending on Ella, of his attempts to hide assets, of his emotional cruelty to his wife and children. Richard, under oath, was forced to admit to his infidelity, to his lies, to his callous disregard for his family. But the most devastating blow came when Jessica began to question him about the early days of his company. She produced financial records, old loan agreements, and personal letters that Catherine had saved. She laid out in painstaking detail how the initial seed money for Sterling Holdings had come not from Richard's own pocket, but from a trust fund established by Catherine's grandfather. She showed how Catherine's family connections had secured him his first major development deal, a deal that had been the launching pad for his entire empire. Richard, for the first time in his life, was speechless. The narrative he had so carefully constructed, the myth of the self-made man, was crumbling around him. He was not just a philanderer, he was a fraud. He had built his kingdom on a foundation of his wife's money and her family's influence. The news of the deposition, of the revelations about the origins of Richard's fortune, sent shockwaves through the business community. His reputation, already tarnished, was now in tatters. His business partners began to distance themselves, his stock price wavered, and the empire he had built with such ruthless determination began to seem vulnerable. For Richard, it was the ultimate humiliation. He had lost his family, his reputation, and now he was in danger of losing his company. He was a king in a kingdom that was rapidly shrinking, his power and influence draining away like sand through his fingers. Ella, seeing the writing on the wall, made her move. She realized that the Sterling ship was taking on water and she had no intention of going down with it. She gave an exclusive tell-all interview to a tabloid magazine, painting herself as a victim, a naive young woman who had been seduced and manipulated by a powerful older man. She portrayed Richard as a Svengali figure, a man who had promised her the world and then left her with nothing. It was a calculated act of self-preservation, a final desperate attempt to salvage her own reputation at his expense. The interview was the final nail in Richard's coffin. He was now not just a villain, but a pathetic one. He was a man who had been outplayed by his wife, abandoned by his children, and now publicly betrayed by his mistress. He was alone, isolated in his glass and steel tower, a king with no subjects, no allies, and no one to blame but himself. In the end, he had no choice but to surrender. He agreed to a settlement that was far more generous to Catherine than anything he had ever imagined. She received a significant portion of his fortune, the Fifth Avenue penthouse, the Hamptons house, and a substantial stake in Sterling Holdings. It was not just a victory, it was a vindication. Catherine, Liam, and Chloe stood together on the balcony of the penthouse, looking out at the city that was once again theirs. The war was over. They were bruised, they were scarred, but they were whole. They had faced the storm and had emerged not unscathed but stronger, more united, and with a clearer sense of who they were and what they valued. Catherine Sterling, the woman who had been publicly discarded, had not just survived, she had triumphed. She had reclaimed her name, her fortune, and her family. She was no longer just the wife of a billionaire. She was the matriarch of a new Sterling dynasty, one built not on ruthless ambition and public spectacle, but on loyalty, integrity, and the enduring power of family. The battle had been won, not with a shout, but with a quiet, unshakable resolve. And in the end, that had been the most powerful weapon of all. The aftermath of the Sterling divorce was as closely watched as the initial scandal, but for entirely different reasons. It became a story not of betrayal, but of reinvention. Catherine, now one of the wealthiest women in New York, did not retreat into a life of quiet luxury. Instead, She stepped into a new public role with a grace and purpose that surprised everyone except perhaps her children. She took her seat on the board of Sterling Holdings not as a silent partner, but as an active and influential voice. Her knowledge of the company's history, her innate understanding of the city's social and political landscape, and her newfound confidence made her a formidable presence. She championed a new direction for the company, one that focused on sustainable development, community engagement, and ethical business practices. It was a vision that resonated with a new generation of investors and clients, and under her guidance the company began to regain its footing, its reputation slowly being rebuilt on a foundation of integrity rather than arrogance. Liam, with his mother's backing and a substantial investment from her settlement, launched his own company, Sterling Green. It was a small boutique firm specializing in environmentally conscious urban design. His first project was a low-income housing development in the Bronx, a building that incorporated green roofs, solar panels, and community gardens. It was a project that would have made his father scoff, but it earned Liam the respect of his peers and a sense of fulfillment that he had never found in the corporate world of Sterling Holdings. He was building something that was not just profitable but meaningful. Chloe, graduating from Columbia with honors, turned down lucrative job offers from major auction houses and galleries. Instead, she used a portion of her trust fund, now securely under her mother's control, to establish the Davenport Sterling Arts Foundation. Its mission was to provide grants and mentorship to emerging female artists, the very people she had championed in her student exhibition. She became a passionate and articulate advocate for the arts, a patron who was more interested in nurturing talent than in acquiring trophies. The Sterling family, once a symbol of fractured wealth and public scandal, was now being redefined. They were becoming known for their philanthropy, their commitment to social responsibility, their quiet but powerful influence. They were a family that had been forged in the fire of betrayal and had emerged stronger, more united, and with a shared sense of purpose. And what of Richard? He became a cautionary tale, a ghost that haunted the corridors of power he had once dominated. His personal fortune was diminished, his reputation in ruins. The men who had once courted his favor now avoided his calls. The women who had once vied for his attention now looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. He was a man adrift, a king without a kingdom. He traveled, he bought expensive toys, he dated a string of ever younger women, but he could not escape the shadow of his own actions. He had had it all. A beautiful, intelligent wife, loving children, a vast empire. And he had thrown it all away for a fleeting moment of ego-driven passion. He would sometimes see his family in the society pages, their names now associated with worthy causes and successful ventures. He would see Catherine looking more radiant and confident than ever before a woman who had not just survived his betrayal, but had thrived in its wake. He would see Liam, his face filled with a purpose and a passion that he had never seen in him before. He would see Chloe, a fierce and independent woman who was making her own mark on the world. And in those moments, in the lonely silence of his gilded exile, he would be forced to confront the full weight of his loss. He had toasted his mistress and ignored his wife, and in doing so, he had not just lost a marriage, he had lost his family, his legacy, and a part of himself that he would never be able to reclaim. The Sterling name lived on, but it was no longer his. It belonged to them, to the family that had chosen each other, that had chosen to build a new future from the ashes of the past. The real Sterling empire, he was beginning to understand, was not built of glass and steel, but of love, loyalty, and a resilience that he had so foolishly underestimated. He had won the battle for Ella, but he had lost the war for everything that truly mattered. And that was a defeat from which he would never recover. That was the story of the Sterling family, a story of how one man's betrayal became a catalyst for three people's transformation. It's a reminder that true wealth isn't measured in billions, but in loyalty, integrity, and the unbreakable bonds of family. What did you think of Catherine's journey from a scorned wife to a powerful matriarch? Do you believe Richard got what he deserved in the end? We'd love to hear your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. But for Catherine Vance, it was served on a silver platter under the glittering chandeliers of her own Hamptons estate, with 200 of New York's elite as witnesses. She was the perfect wife to a self-made millionaire, a pillar of quiet elegance in a world of loud money. But when her husband, Julian Croft, raised a champagne flute to toast a new beginning, he wasn't toasting her. He was toasting his pregnant mistress. He thought it was a power move, the ultimate display of his invincibility. He didn't know that Catherine's smile was a war cry, and in her Hermes clutch she wasn't carrying lipstick. She was carrying his ruin. The air in the Hamptons in late August is different. It's thick with the scent of salt money and the quiet desperation of summer's end. For Catherine Vance, it smelled of betrayal. For the past 6 weeks, that scent had been her constant companion, clinging to the silk sheets in her marital bed, mingling with the expensive perfume on her husband's collars, and tainting the taste of the morning espresso she no longer shared with him. Their life from the outside was an Instagram-perfect fantasy. The sprawling contemporary mansion in Southampton, a glass and cedar monolith overlooking the Atlantic, was featured in Architectural Digest. Julian Croft, her husband, was the golden boy of tech finance, a millionaire many times over by 35 with a jawline as sharp as his business acumen. He hadn't been born into money, but he'd acquired it with a ferocity that both terrified and thrilled the old money establishment. Catherine, daughter of a respected but not extravagantly wealthy history professor, was his perfect counterpart. Graceful, intelligent, and possessing an understated elegance that made the new money wives look garish. She ran their homes, the Hamptons estate, the Park Avenue penthouse, with the precision of a CEO. She chaired the galas, charmed the investors, and smoothed over Julian's occasional brutishness with a serene smile. She was as Vanity Fair had once gushed the velvet glove on Croft's iron fist. For 7 years the arrangement had worked. She had loved him, or at least she had loved the man she thought he was. The ambitious, charming visionary who had swept her off her feet. In return, she had believed he loved her, but the last year had seen a slow, creeping corrosion. The late nights at the office became more frequent. Business trips to Singapore or Zurich were extended by days with flimsy excuses. He grew distant, his eyes glazing over when she spoke of her day, his hand reflexively pulling away when she reached for it. The first concrete clue was a receipt. It fell out of his briefcase one morning as he rushed out a crisp slip from a boutique she'd never heard of, La Petite Nouveauté. It was a high-end maternity store in Soho. The purchase, a cashmere nursing shawl, and a diamond-studded pacifier clip. The total was more than her father's monthly mortgage payment. Catherine felt the floor drop out from under her. They weren't trying for a baby. They hadn't been for years after a painful and private struggle with infertility that Julian had decreed they would no longer discuss. "We have a great life, Ellie," he'd said, his tone final. "Let's not complicate it." Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. She knew. In that instant she knew everything and nothing. The stray blonde hairs on his jacket, the hushed phone calls he took on the terrace, the second phone he thought he'd hidden so cleverly in his gym bag. It all clicked into place with sickening clarity. Her first instinct was to confront him, to scream, to shatter the cold, perfect facade of their lives. But a deeper, colder instinct took over. The part of her that had watched her quiet, intellectual father be steamrolled by more aggressive colleagues her whole life. The part of her that had learned to navigate the shark-infested waters of New York society. That part whispered, "Not yet. Don't be emotional. Be smart." She called the only person she knew she could trust implicitly Marcus Thorne. Marcus was a partner at a white shoe law firm, a man whose quiet demeanor hid a mind like a steel trap. He had been her father's student at Columbia Law before he became a legal titan, and he'd always had a soft spot for Catherine, a paternal sort of protectiveness. They met in a discreet corner of the Carlyle's Bemelman's bar, the whimsical murals a stark contrast to the grimness of their conversation. Catherine laid it out, her voice low and steady, betraying none of the seismic terror she felt. The receipt. The second phone, the emotional distance. Marcus listened, his steepled fingers hiding his mouth. He didn't interrupt. When she finished, he took a slow sip of his Macallan. "Catherine," he said, his voice a low rumble. "What do you want?" "I don't know," she whispered, the first crack in her composure. "Yes, you do," he countered gently. "You want to know who she is. You want to know the extent of the damage, and then you want to decide whether to scorch the earth or walk away quietly. My advice: prepare for scorched earth. With a man like Julian, there's rarely another option." He was right. Quietly walking away was not in Julian's vocabulary, and it wouldn't be in hers either. He had made a fool of her. He had desecrated the private grief of their infertility. He had built a secret life on a foundation of her trust. She wouldn't just walk away. She would take a wrecking ball to the entire edifice. "How do we prepare?" she asked, her voice hardening. "You do nothing," Marcus instructed. "You be the perfect wife. You smile, you host, you attend. You give him no reason to suspect that you know anything. In the meantime, I will engage a private investigator. A very good, very discreet one. We need photos, names, dates. We need to document every dollar of marital assets he spent on this new venture." And so Catherine the actress was born. She played the part of her life. She welcomed Julian home with a kiss, ignoring the faint, unfamiliar floral scent on his skin. She asked about his day, feigning interest in mergers and acquisitions while her mind raced with images of him with another woman. It was a harrowing, soul-shredding performance. The investigator, a former Mossad agent named Ari, was ruthlessly efficient. Within 2 weeks, Catherine had a name and a face. Serafina Monet, a 26-year-old art gallery assistant from a modest background in Queens. She was beautiful in a way that was the polar opposite of Catherine's classic grace. She was all flowing blonde hair, bee-stung lips, and a palpable hungry ambition in her eyes. Ari's photos were a gallery of gut punches, Julian and Serafina laughing in Central Park, his hand resting proprietorially on her swollen belly, the two of them entering a lavishly furnished West Village apartment, an apartment Ari discovered that was owned by a shell corporation funded by a subsidiary of Croft Enterprises. He wasn't just having an affair. He had built her a life, a parallel life funded by their joint assets. Marcus was clinical. "This is good, Catherine. This is leverage. The apartment is a clear violation of the financial clauses in your prenuptial agreement. It constitutes a fraudulent transfer of marital property." The prenup. Another one of Julian's brilliant ideas, signed a week before their wedding. It was an ironclad document that, in the event of a divorce, would leave Catherine with a respectable but, by his standards, paltry sum. A thank you for her time. It was designed to protect his empire. But Marcus had found a hairline crack in it. The fidelity clause, often considered archaic, was something her father had insisted on including. It stated that in the case of proven adultery leading to the birth of a child, the financial penalties against Julian would be severe. But proving it in a way that would trigger the clause was the challenge. "He will bury us in litigation," Catherine said, looking at the photos of Serafina, who was now visibly heavily pregnant. "Let him try," Marcus said. "We just need the one perfect, undeniable moment of proof. Public acknowledgement is the gold standard." And then, as if delivered by the gods of vengeance themselves, Julian gave her that moment on a silver platter. He approached her one evening in the library of their Hamptons home. He was buzzing with an energy she hadn't seen directed at her in years. "Ellie, darling, I have a brilliant idea." He began pouring himself a brandy. "I want to host a party. End of summer. A real blowout. Here." Catherine kept her expression neutral. "Oh, what's the occasion?" "A celebration," he said, beaming. "A celebration of new beginnings. We just closed the Apex deal. It's a huge win. I want to toast the future of the company." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The Apex deal had closed 2 months ago. She looked at him at the practiced ease with which he lied to her face and felt a cold fury settle deep in her bones. She knew with chilling certainty what this party was really for. It was for her. It was a public coronation for his mistress. He was going to install her and their child into his life, and this party was the announcement. He was so arrogant, so convinced of her meek compliance that he was going to do it in their home. "A party," Catherine said, her voice smooth as glass. "What a wonderful idea, Julian. It should be a night no one will ever forget." His smile was triumphant. He had no idea how true her words would be. The planning began. Julian, for the first time, took an active interest. He wanted a marquee on the lawn, a jazz ensemble from the city, and catering by Jean-Georges. He insisted on a specific theme: new beginnings. He personally curated the guest list, a who's who of their world. Investors, rival society columnists, and the matriarchs who ruled the social scene. And he told her with a casualness that was almost comical he was inviting a few rising stars from the art world. "A new artist I'm thinking of patronizing," he'd said. "Serafina Monet. I think you'll like her." Catherine just smiled. "I can't wait to meet her." In the 2 weeks leading up to the party, Catherine didn't just play the part of the perfect hostess. She became a general planning a war. She and Marcus worked in secret late-night calls and encrypted emails, their new normal. Marcus filed the initial divorce petition to be held and served at the exact right moment. He hired a process server, a discreet man who would be disguised as one of the catering staff. They prepared the financial statements, the investigators' reports, the evidence of the Shell Corporation. It was a mountain of betrayal condensed into a single lethal legal document. Catherine also made a call to a name in her contacts list she hadn't used in years. Harrison Blake, the most feared and respected public relations specialist in New York, a man known for his ability to craft or destroy a narrative. She met him for a clandestine coffee and told him everything. He listened, a predatory glint in his eye. "So," he'd said, "you don't just want to divorce him. You want to utterly dismantle him, publicly. I like it. It's got style." On the day of the party, a strange calm descended upon Catherine. She spent the afternoon at a spa, not for relaxation, but for armor. Her hair was swept into a chignon so severe it was a statement. Her makeup was flawless, her red lipstick a slash of defiance. She chose her dress with surgical precision, a sleek column gown of midnight blue Tom Ford silk. It was beautiful but severe. It was not the dress of a happy wife. It was the dress of a woman going into battle. As she stood before the mirror, she saw not the trembling, heartbroken woman she had been 6 weeks ago, but a stranger she was coming to admire. This woman was cold, focused, and unbreakable. Julian Croft had intended to humiliate her. He was about to learn what a fatal miscalculation that was. He had forged his wife in the fire of his own betrayal, and now she was coming to collect. The marquee was a cathedral of white canvas and fairy lights on the vast emerald lawn, the Atlantic sighing in the distance. Inside, the air hummed with the sound of 200 of New York's most powerful people trying to out-talk, out-laugh, and outshine one another. Waiters in crisp white jackets moved like ghosts through the crowd, their silver trays laden with flutes of Dom Perignon and canapés that were miniature works of art. A jazz trio played softly in the corner, a smooth, decadent soundtrack for the unfolding drama. Catherine moved through the party with the practiced grace of a queen in her court. She greeted guests with a warm smile and a light touch on the arm, her Tom Ford gown shimmering under the soft lights. People complimented her on the magnificent party, on her home, on her impeccable taste. "You've outdone yourself, Catherine," gushed Blythe Carrington, a society doyen whose approval could make or break a social season. "Julian must be so proud. He's a man worth celebrating." Catherine replied, her voice smooth as silk, a hint of double meaning in her words that no one could possibly detect. She saw Julian across the lawn holding court. He was in his element, a magnate at the peak of his power. He wore a custom Brioni suit, his Patek Philippe watch catching the light. He was laughing, a booming, confident sound that always grated on her nerves. And standing just a little too close to him, bathed in his glow, was Serafina Monet. She was exactly as she was in the photographs, but more vivid, more real. She wore a flowing white empire waist dress that did little to conceal her advanced pregnancy. Her blonde hair was a halo around her face, and she looked up at Julian with an expression of pure adoration. She was touching his arm, her hand resting there for a second longer than was appropriate. A few people noticed. Catherine saw the flicker of a glance between two rival hedge fund managers, the slight knowing smirk on a gossip columnist's face. The whispers were already starting. Catherine's heart gave a painful lurch, but she willed it into submission. Stick to the plan, she told herself. Let him do it. Let him hang himself. She caught the eye of the process server, a man named Frank, who was impeccably disguised as a senior waiter, his posture perfect, a white napkin draped over his arm. He gave a nearly imperceptible nod. He was in position. Marcus Thorne. Her lawyer was not present but was on standby a short drive away waiting for her call. Harrison Blake, the PR guru, had already drafted the press release that would be sent to every major news outlet the second she gave the word. The pieces were all in place. An hour into the party, Julian stepped onto the small stage where the band was playing and tapped a crystal glass with a spoon. The chatter slowly died down as the crowd turned their attention to him. He was beaming, his face flushed with champagne and triumph. "Friends, colleagues, thank you all for coming," he began, his voice booming through the microphone. "I know the invitation said this was to celebrate the Apex deal, and it is. It's a testament to the hard work of my incredible team." He paused for a smattering of polite applause. Catherine stood near the front, her expression a perfect mask of wifely pride. She could feel the weight of hundreds of pairs of eyes on them, the power couple, the hosts of this perfect evening. But tonight, Julian continued, his voice taking on a more intimate, more emotional tone, is about more than just business. It's about the future. It's about new beginnings. His eyes scanned the crowd moving past Catherine without a flicker of recognition and landed squarely on Serafina Monet. A collective silent intake of breath seemed to ripple through the marquee. The whispers grew louder. This was it. "Sometimes in life you make plans," Julian said, his gaze locked with his mistress's. "You build something, you think you know what your path is. And then something or someone comes along and shows you a new path. A more authentic one. A path towards true happiness and legacy." Catherine felt a cold, sharp calm settle over her. He was actually doing it. His arrogance was truly boundless. He was about to announce his affair and his illegitimate child in front of everyone who mattered in their world in her home. "I've learned that you have to be bold to get what you want in this life," he went on, raising his glass. "You have to be willing to tear down old structures to build something more beautiful and more meaningful." He was looking directly at Catherine now, a glint of challenge in his eyes. It was a public dismissal. He was tearing down their marriage right here, right now. "So I want to propose a toast," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "Not just to a new deal, but to a new life. To my new beginning. To the future mother of my child. To Serafina." He raised his glass high. Serafina, standing by the stage, had tears in her eyes. She placed a hand on her swollen belly, looking radiant and victorious. A stunned, deafening silence fell over the party. The jazz trio faltered. No one moved. No one clinked their glass. They just stared, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and for some cruel delight. They looked from Julian to the pregnant blonde, and then as one, their heads turned to the wronged wife. They turned to Catherine. They expected to see her crumble. They expected tears, a panicked retreat, a scene. They were disappointed. Catherine did not move a muscle. She held her serene smile, though it was now edged with ice. She let the silence stretch, letting the full weight of Julian's social suicide settle over the crowd. She let them absorb the sheer naked audacity of it. Then, with the calm, deliberate grace that had defined her for 7 years, she placed her untouched champagne flute on a passing waiter's tray. She walked towards the stage. The crowd parted for her like the Red Sea. Julian watched her approach, a flicker of uncertainty finally entering his eyes. He hadn't expected this. He had expected her to flee in humiliation. She reached the stage and took the microphone from his hand. He let her take it, a confused look on his face. She turned to the stunned audience. "Thank you, Julian. she said, her voice clear and resonant, carrying to every corner of the tent. There was no tremor, no hint of tears, only a chilling, absolute control. That was quite the announcement. It takes a special kind of man to celebrate his future by demolishing his past so publicly. A nervous titter went through the crowd. "You're right," she continued, her eyes finding his. "Tonight is indeed about new beginnings. It's about tearing down old rotten structures to build something better." She gave the slightest, most subtle nod to her left. Frank, the process server, began to move. He walked with purpose, weaving through the frozen statues of the 1%, his path clear towards the stage. "You spoke of your new beginning, Julian," Catherine said, her voice dropping a little lower, drawing everyone in. "And I believe every person deserves that. Which is why I wanted to give you yours right here, right now, in front of all the people whose opinions you value so much." Frank had reached the stage. He stood beside a stunned Julian, holding a thick manila envelope. Catherine's eyes, cold and bright, locked onto her husband's. "My new beginning starts tonight. It starts with telling the truth. And it starts with this." She turned from the microphone and looked at Julian. "Julian Croft," she said, her voice now devoid of all warmth, "you've been served." Frank stepped forward and placed the envelope squarely in Julian's hand. The words, "Summons and Complaint Dissolution of Marriage," were visible on the front. A collective gasp swept the marquee. It was a sound Catherine would cherish for the rest of her life. Julian stared at the papers in his hand as if they were a snake. The color drained from his face. His jaw, that famous sharp jawline, went slack. He looked from the papers to Catherine, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and fury. Serafina let out a small, horrified cry. Her moment of triumph had curdled into a nightmare. Catherine leaned back towards the microphone for her final words to the captivated audience. "Thank you all for coming," she said, her smile finally reaching her eyes. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated victory. "Please enjoy the rest of the party. I believe I paid for it." And with that she turned, descended the steps of the stage, and walked, not ran, through the stunned, silent crowd. She didn't look back. She walked out of the marquee, out of her home, and out of the life that had been a beautiful, gilded cage. The salt-scented air of the Hamptons had never smelled so sweet. It smelled finally of freedom. The aftermath of the toast was not a quiet fallout. It was a nuclear explosion in the closed, gossipy ecosystem of New York's elite. Before Catherine's car had even reached the Long Island Expressway, Harrison Blake's press release had hit the inboxes of every journalist, from the New York Post's Page 6 to the Wall Street Journal. The headline was a masterpiece of controlled demolition. Catherine Vance files for divorce amidst husband Julian Croft's shocking baby shower announcement for mistress. It wasn't just a story about infidelity. It was a story about power, hubris, and a wife who had refused to be a victim. Catherine was painted not as a scorned woman, but as a strategic genius. The narrative was hers. Julian was trapped. By publicly acknowledging Serafina and the child, he had handed Marcus Thorne the silver bullet they needed. The fidelity clause in the prenup was now a ticking time bomb set to detonate under his financial empire. The first few days were a blur of frantic, furious phone calls from Julian. They went straight to a new number Catherine had, one only Marcus and a few others possessed. His voicemails were a case study in narcissistic rage, cycling through disbelief threats, and then most pathetically desperate pleading. "Ellie, pick up the phone. You don't know what you're doing. You're destroying everything. You think you can pull this stunt and get away with it? I will bury you in court for years, Catherine. You will not see a dime more than what that prenup says." Okay, I messed up. It was a mistake. But we can fix this. We can be smart. Don't let these lawyers poison you against me. It's us, Ellie. It's always been us." Catherine listened to them once, a detached curiosity on her face, then deleted them. The us he spoke of had been a fiction, and she was done with his stories. Their war room was a sleek, soundproofed conference room in Marcus Thorne's midtown office, overlooking the spires of St. Patrick's Cathedral. The table was covered in documents, financial disclosures, bank statements, and the meticulously detailed report from Ari, the private investigator. He's panicking, Marcus said, pointing to a series of panicked stock transfers Julian had made in the 48 hours following the party. He's trying to move assets, hide them in offshore accounts and complex trusts. He's acting like a common criminal. Isn't he? Catherine asked, her voice dry. Legally, he's just being stupid, Marcus replied with a thin smile. Every transaction creates a digital footprint. He's so used to people being afraid of him that he's forgotten how to be careful. His arrogance is our greatest asset. Julian's legal team, a pack of snarling corporate litigators from a firm known for its scorched earth tactics, requested a settlement meeting. They met in a neutral location, a conference center that felt as sterile as a hospital. Julian was there looking haggard. The confident swagger was gone, replaced by a tense, coiled anger. His lead attorney, a slick man named Richard Sterling, laid out their offer. It was the exact amount stipulated in the original prenup. "This is a generous offer, Catherine," Sterling said condescendingly. "It allows you to walk away with dignity and avoid a long, unpleasant public battle." Catherine didn't even look at him. She looked directly at her husband. "Dignity?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "You want to talk about dignity after what you did in our home?" Julian flinched. Marcus took over, his tone calm and professorial. "Richard, let's dispense with the theater. Your client, on a microphone in front of 200 witnesses, publicly acknowledged an affair that resulted in a child. This action triggers Section 11, subsection B of the prenuptial agreement, the infidelity clause. As such, the financial limitations of the agreement are rendered null and void. My client is entitled to 50% of all marital assets accumulated during their 7-year marriage." Sterling laughed, a short barking sound. "That's absurd. We will argue that Ms. Vance was aware of the relationship, that her actions at the party were a calculated, malicious act designed to inflict maximum damage. We will depose every friend, every staff member. We will paint her as a vindictive gold digger." "Go ahead," Catherine said, speaking for herself again. Her calmness was more unnerving than any outburst. "Depose my friends who listened to me cry about my husband's sudden business trips. Depose the staff who cleaned up the unfamiliar lipstick from his shirts. Depose the driver who dropped him off not at his office but at a West Village apartment building twice a week. And while you're at it, be sure to get a deposition from Serafina Monet. I'd love to hear her account of how my husband used funds from our joint accounts to pay her rent and buy her diamond pacifier clips." The room went silent. Julian stared at her, a dawning horror in his eyes. He had drastically underestimated her. He had seen her as a beautiful passive accessory to his life. He had never, not once, considered that she was paying attention. The meeting ended without a resolution, but a clear line had been drawn in the sand. The next front in the war opened as expected, with Genevieve Croft, Julian's formidable mother. A woman carved from New England granite and old money. Genevieve cared about only one thing: the Croft family legacy. A messy public divorce was a stain on that legacy. She summoned Catherine to her cavernous, dimly lit apartment on the Upper East Side, a museum of ancestral portraits and suffocating tradition. "Catherine," she began without any preamble, "this foolishness has gone on long enough. You've made your point. You embarrassed Julian. Now it's time to be sensible." "Sensible?" Catherine asked, refusing the tea that was offered. "Was it sensible for your son to impregnate his assistant and announce it at a party in my home?" Genevieve waved a dismissive hand, her diamond bracelets clattering. "Julian is a man. Men are weak. They make mistakes. But the family, the name, that is what endures. This public spectacle you've created is damaging his business. It's damaging our name." "He created the spectacle," Catherine corrected her calmly. "I simply ended the performance." Genevieve's eyes narrowed. "What do you want?" "What I am owed," Catherine said. "Justice." "Justice is a concept for poets." Genevieve sniffed. "I am talking about money. Name your price. I will write you a check myself to make this go away. Sign a non-disclosure agreement and disappear gracefully." It was the ultimate insult. She was being treated like another one of Julian's mistresses, a problem to be paid off and discarded. The quiet professor's daughter in her rose again, but this time she was armed with fury. "With all due respect, Genevieve, you don't have enough money to buy my silence," Catherine said, rising from her chair. "Your son broke something and he's going to pay to fix it. Not you. Him. The name you're so worried about? He tarnished it. I'm just polishing my own." She walked out, leaving the Croft matriarch speechless for what was likely the first time in her 70 years. The battle raged on for weeks, a war of attrition fought through legal motions and discovery requests. Julian's team tried to bury them in paperwork demanding years of Catherine's personal credit card statements, her emails, her text messages, searching for any hint of indiscretion on her part. They found nothing. Catherine's life had been an open book. Her only secret had been her growing sorrow. Meanwhile, a new unexpected player was growing restless, Serafina Monet. The fairy tale Julian had promised her had vanished. The triumphant entry into society had turned into a public shaming. She was no longer the radiant mother-to-be. She was the homewrecker in a tabloid scandal. Julian, consumed by his legal battles and cratering reputation, was becoming distant and irritable. The funding for her lavish lifestyle began to dry up as his accounts were frozen and scrutinized. The West Village apartment suddenly felt less like a love nest and more like a gilded cage, much like the one Catherine had just escaped. Serafina was young and ambitious, but she wasn't stupid. She saw that Julian was a sinking ship, and she and her unborn child were tied to his ankle. She started to think about her own future, and she realized her greatest leverage wasn't with Julian, but potentially with his wife. One evening, Marcus Thorne received a call from a blocked number. "Is this Marcus Thorne, Catherine Vance's lawyer?" a young woman's voice asked, hesitant and nervous. "It is. To whom am I speaking?" "My name is Serafina Monet," the voice said, and Marcus almost dropped the phone. I think we need to talk." It was the twist neither he nor Catherine had seen coming. The mistress was about to become their star witness. The war was about to take a decisive and devastating turn. The designated meeting place was a grand suite at the Mandarin Oriental, a bastion of impersonal luxury high above Columbus Circle. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a god's-eye view of Central Park, but the panorama of autumn foliage felt distant and unreal. Inside the suite, the air was thick with a sterile, climate-controlled tension. Catherine sat on a plush velvet sofa, a cup of untouched tea cooling on the marble table before her. She was a statue of composure in a tailored Roland Mouret dress, but her mind was a whirlwind. Meeting the woman who had lived in the shadow of her marriage felt like a necessary yet deeply violating step. It was one thing to see photos, another to breathe the same air. Marcus Thorne stood by the window, his hands clasped behind his back, his presence a calming, solid anchor in the room. "Remember, Catherine," he said, his voice a low murmur that didn't carry. "She is not your enemy today. She is a tool, a desperate one, and desperate tools can be the most effective." Catherine nodded, her gaze fixed on the door. "I know, Marcus, but it's difficult to separate the tool from the woman who slept with my husband." Before he could reply, a soft knock echoed. A hotel staff member opened the door to admit a figure swathed in a Burberry scarf and oversized Chanel sunglasses. Serafina Monet entered the room hesitantly, her high-fashion armor doing little to conceal her vulnerability. She was visibly more pregnant than before, and the confident radiance she'd displayed at the party had been extinguished, replaced by a pallor of exhaustion and fear. Her eyes darted around the opulent suite before landing on Catherine, and she visibly recoiled a small involuntary step back. I didn't know you would be here," she stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Her hand instinctively went to her stomach, a protective gesture. Catherine rose, not out of courtesy, but to meet her on equal footing. She felt a strange cold detachment. This wasn't the vixen from the photographs. This was a frightened girl who had placed a bad bet. "My life is being dismantled, Ms. Monet," Catherine stated, her tone glacial but even. "I find it's best to be present for the demolition. Please sit." Serafina perched nervously on the edge of an armchair, her designer handbag clutched in her lap like a life raft. The silence stretched thick and uncomfortable until Marcus stepped forward, his professional demeanor cutting through the personal animosity. "Ms. Monet," he began gently, "you called us. You said you needed to talk. We're here to listen." Tears welled in Serafina's eyes, and she fought to keep them from spilling. "He's abandoned me." She said the words a raw, broken confession. "Since the party, everything changed. The calls stopped. The money." He said his lawyers advised him to cease all contact and support that every dollar could be used against him. "He called me a liability. Last week I received an eviction notice for the apartment. He promised me a life of family. He said our son would carry the Croft name with pride." Her voice cracked on the last word. "Now he calls me a complication he has to manage." Catherine listened unmoved. Every word was a confirmation of the man she now knew Julian to be. He didn't build things, he acquired them. And when they ceased to be valuable or became inconvenient, he discarded them. She and Serafina were in that moment simply different models of the same disposable commodity. "He's a coward," Catherine said the words flat and factual. "He's a coward who hides behind his money. But that doesn't answer our question. What do you want from us?" Serafina's fear hardened into something new resolve. She had been pushed to the edge, and now she was ready to push back. "I want to secure my son's future, a future that Julian is trying to erase. And I want to make sure he can never hold his promises over another woman's head again." She paused, taking a deep breath. "In return, I will give you the weapon you need to destroy him." With trembling hands, she opened her handbag. She didn't just pull out the burner phone and the ledger. She placed them on the table with the deliberate finality of a confession. The phone was a sleek, anonymous black rectangle. The ledger was bound in dark green leather, looking deceptively ordinary. "This phone," she began, pushing it forward, "is where he let his guard down. He thought it was untraceable. He sent hundreds of texts. He detailed his plans to leave you after the baby was born. He complained about the financial gymnastics required to fund my life without you noticing. He named accounts, he mentioned transfers. It's all there." Catherine's stomach clenched, but her face remained a mask. It was one thing to know, another to see the sordid details spelled out in her husband's own words. "And this," Serafina said, her hand resting on the green leather ledger, "is his pride and his folly." She looked directly at Catherine. "He showed it to me one night after a bottle of very expensive wine. He was trying to impress me, to show me how much more powerful he was than anyone knew. He called it his Bible, his shadow ledger. It's a handwritten record of every asset he's hidden from you, from his company, from the IRS. Shell corporations, offshore accounts, real estate in names that don't exist. A cryptocurrency wallet he bragged was purer than gold. He said it was his real empire, the one the world could never touch." Marcus picked up the ledger, his movements precise. He opened it, his eyes scanning the neat columns of Julian's arrogant script. A low whistle escaped his lips. He looked up first at Serafina, then at Catherine, and in his gaze Catherine saw the entire landscape of the warshift. This wasn't just a bigger gun. It was a nuclear code. "This isn't just leverage, Catherine," Marcus said, his voice charged with a new lethal intensity. "This is a kill shot. The infidelity clause would have cost him a fortune. This is proof of systemic long-term financial fraud and perjury. He signed financial disclosures in your divorce proceedings, swearing under oath that he had revealed all his assets. This ledger proves he is a liar and a felon. If this is authenticated and Ms. Monet testifies to its origin, he won't just lose the divorce case. He'll face a federal investigation. He could go to prison." The weight of the ledger on the table seemed to suck all the air out of the room. This went beyond marital betrayal into a realm of criminality that could utterly annihilate the man Julian Croft presented to the world. Catherine's gaze fell on Serafina, who looked pale but resolute. "Why?" Catherine asked the question softer this time, colored with a grim curiosity. "Why give us this? You could have used it to blackmail him yourself." Serafina shook her head, a single tear finally tracing a path down her cheek. Blackmail would keep me tied to him forever, waiting for the next check, living in fear. I don't want his money that way. I want freedom. For me and for my son. He used me to wound you. He planned to use our child as a pawn in his dynasty. But my son will not be a tool for a man like that. He will be safe. That is all I want. The raw sincerity in her voice was undeniable. She was not an ally, but her goals had aligned perfectly with Catherine's. An agreement was drawn up by Marcus right there in the suite. It was not a payoff. It was a carefully structured legal document creating an irrevocable trust for the benefit of baby boy Monet. The funds would be substantial enough for education and a secure start in life, managed by a neutral third-party bank and inaccessible to both Serafina and Julian. In exchange, Serafina would turn over all evidence and provide a sworn affidavit attesting to its authenticity, ready to testify if needed. She signed her name with a hand that was finally steady. Her war was over. Catherine's was about to reach its endgame. The final settlement meeting felt like the prelude to an execution. Julian arrived with his lawyer, Richard Sterling, attempting to project an air of weary impatience, as if Catherine's persistence was merely a nuisance. He had lost weight, and the dark circles under his eyes were not well concealed by concealer. He refused to look at Catherine. "Let's get this over with." Sterling began sliding the same old offer across the polished mahogany table. "This is our final offer. Take it or we'll see you in court for the next 5 years." Marcus Thorne let the offer sit there untouched. He smiled a thin, chilling expression. "Richard, I appreciate your commitment to theatrics, but the show is over." He reached into his own leather briefcase and produced a single high-quality photocopy. He didn't slide it. He placed it gently in the center of the table. It was a page from the Shadow Ledger, the one detailing a shell corporation in the Cayman Islands named JEC Holdings. Julian Catherine Croft, with a valuation of over $30 million in bearer bonds and property. Julian's handwriting was as clear as day. Julian's eyes fell to the paper. The change was instantaneous and catastrophic. The blood drained from his face, leaving a waxy gray sheen. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple. He stared at the page as if it were a venomous snake, his carefully constructed composure shattering into a million pieces. His gaze shot up wild and panicked, not to Marcus, but to Catherine. The question was in his eyes. "How? Where did you get this?" he stammered, his voice a strangled, unfamiliar sound. "The source is now our privileged work product," Marcus said, his voice dropping to the cold, clinical tone of a surgeon. "What matters is that we have the entire ledger. We have text messages corroborating the deliberate, fraudulent hiding of marital assets. Your client Richard has committed perjury on a scale that would make a hardened criminal blush. So we can discuss your offer, which is based on a fraudulent financial landscape, or we can discuss our new terms. Alternatively, I can walk this ledger over to the U.S. Attorney's Office this afternoon. I'm sure their white-collar crime division would be fascinated." Sterling looked from the paper to his client's imploding face and back again. The fight was gone. The shark had been harpooned. Marcus slid a new, thicker document across the table. "Our terms are not negotiable. My client will receive 60% of the total marital estate, both declared and as yet undeclared. We have a forensic accounting team ready to verify the ledger's contents. She will retain sole ownership of the Park Avenue penthouse and the Hamptons estate free and clear. The art collection is hers. Julian will be responsible for all tax liabilities arising from his creative accounting. Sign this today and the ledger remains a private matter between us. Hesitate, and it becomes a public record." It was total unconditional surrender. Julian was shaking his hands, trembling. He looked at Catherine, his eyes finally begging, searching for a trace of the woman he had married. The woman who had once loved him, forgiven his moods and propped up his ego. "Ellie, please," he breathed the name, a desperate plea. "Don't do this." Catherine leaned forward for the first time, her voice low, precise, and utterly devoid of pity. "Do what Julian. Expose a liar, a thief, a man who would humiliate his wife and then abandon his pregnant mistress when she became inconvenient. No. I'm not doing anything to you. I am simply collecting on the debt you created. She paused, letting the words sink in. You toasted to your new beginning. It's only fair I get to start mine. Sign the papers. Defeated, broken, and utterly outplayed, Julian Croft picked up the heavy gold pen his lawyer offered him. His signature, once a bold, decisive slash, was now the barely legible scrawl of a beaten man. He signed away his empire, his reputation, and his power, all with a few strokes. Catherine stood without a word. She didn't look at the papers. She didn't look at Julian. Her business there was concluded. With Marcus at her side, she walked out of the conference room, leaving the architect of her misery to sit amongst the ruins of his own making. The war was over. She had won. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a cheating husband and a vengeful wife. It was a story about the masks we wear and the price of taking them off. Julian Croft built an empire on an image of invincibility, but it was a house of cards brought down by his own hubris. Catherine Vance wore the mask of the perfect passive wife until she was pushed too far. She discovered that her greatest strength wasn't her grace or her beauty, but the quiet, meticulous intelligence her husband had always overlooked. She didn't just get revenge. She got justice, reclaiming her narrative and her future. Her story is a powerful reminder that the most formidable power often lies not in shouting, but in planning, waiting, and knowing exactly when to strike. If this story of strength and strategy resonated with you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who needs to hear that it's possible to rebuild from the ashes. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell for more real-life dramas just like this one. What did you think of Catherine's final move? Let us know in the comments below.